Hey there, fellow explorers. Today we're diving deep into the past of retro diving gear. Now, we all know that modern scuba technology is uber sleek, safe, and reliable, but here's a shocker. Some of the equipment that was used years ago was, a little terrifying. In this video, we're going to look at 10 dangerous old diving features that are now a relic of the past. Let's start today's list with the heavy gear hats, aka the old-fashioned diving helmets. These bad boys were made of brass and weighed a ton. They were large, cumbersome, and could weigh anywhere from 20 to 50 pounds, with a metal neck dam that constricted your movements. They were connected to an air supply via a long hose that would typically pump air from the surface. You'd be underwater, trying to move like a graceful dolphin, but instead looking like a clunky robot. The diver's helmet had a copper or brass dome and a glass faceplate, offering a small window to the ocean world. Also, the air supply was not so great either. So many divers risked suffocation, choking, or being carried off by underwater currents. One of the most legendary accidents involved diver Carl Brashear, who lost a leg using this gear. The helmet's weight made it difficult to work and move about, and once combined with the risk of low air supply, it was an accident waiting to happen. But at least they look straight out of 1,000 Leagues Under the Sea, right? Surface-supplied air was once a major part of diving operations. The idea was simple: a hose extended from a surface pump that fed air into the helmet or suit of the diver. The drawback? If the air supply line was cut or clogged, there was no backup. These pumps would supply a constant stream of air to the diver through a long hose attached to their helmet or suit. And we have to give it to them old-timers. The idea is not even that bad, since it allows the diver for way longer dives than if restricted to the air supply of a tank. The downside, though, divers were unable to breathe from their own air tanks, as newer equipment allows nowadays, making them completely dependent on their peers on the boat. I have some really good friends, but I'm not sure if they're that good. In one famous case, diver Henry Phillips ran out of his air supply because his surface pump failed him, and he sadly did not have time to escape. Those pumps were also heavy, noisy, and faulty. Just think of having to remain calm underwater with the ever-present, ear-shattering roar of a pump. Now that's a stress test. Now let's talk about communication, one of the most crucial parts of diving. We all know how much we cherish being able to talk to your dive partner, but originally divers utilized the Sieb Gorman intercom system. Intercoms were mounted on helmets and permitted divers to communicate with the surface team. The intercom was a wired setup, with a speaker inside the helmet and a microphone outside, relying on tangled wires that could easily be damaged during the dive. So it isn't even that surprising to hear that sometimes they didn't work. Wires got tangled, or worse, they stopped transmitting altogether, leaving divers with no way of calling for help. There are records of divers being lost at sea due to communication failure. There was an incident in the early 20th century where divers working on underwater cables were left stranded when their intercoms failed. Without communication, they couldn't get instructions or warnings about sudden currents, and many suffered from disorientation and exhaustion. Probably the only kind of chat you'd want with your crew while underwater. The next thing we will discuss on today's list is the twin hose regulators, the bread and butter of many divers in the early days. But let's be honest, they looked more like a vacuum cleaner attachment than any modern diving gear we're familiar with today. The setup involved two hoses, one for air intake and the other to expel exhaled air. The most dangerous feature of twin hose regulators was the regulator itself. The problem? They were bulky, heavy, and prone to leaking. During dives, divers would often find themselves struggling with tangled hoses, leading to frustration and panic. In some cases, divers would even experience sudden air deprivation. One of the tragedies involved a diver named Joe Smith, who was diving on a twin hose regulator during a deep-water dive. The hoses were tangled, and the leak drained his air supply before he was able to ascend safely. It was not so much the hose's fault, but the system was nowhere near as safe and efficient as what we have today. Atmospheric suits, essentially movable pressure chambers for divers, were used in deep-sea diving. The bulky, huge, heavy suits were intended to keep divers under constant surface pressure, even as they descended into ocean depths. The idea was to protect divers from the lethal deep-sea pressure, such as decompression sickness. These suits, however, had dangerous, hazardous consequences of their own. They were made of rigid materials, which strictly limited mobility, and it was difficult for divers to escape underwater hazards in a rush. They also posed dangers of injury from the pressure inside the suit. In a well-known accident, diver George Wilson was working in an atmospheric suit when the air supply failed. With no way of regulating the pressure of the suit, he was subjected to extreme pressure differentials, resulting in a catastrophe. The suits were also cumbersome and created additional dangers in the event that the diver became disoriented or lost. Lastly, the atmospheric suit was replaced by less restrictive and especially more effective diving gear, but at the cost of taking a few lives along the way. It looked like a spacesuit, but for the waters. Which one would you rather try? Another scary piece of equipment was the heavy equipment boots, designed to help divers maintain balance and stability while working underwater, but especially in deep water. The boots were constructed from heavy rubber or brass and weighed a few pounds per boot. While they helped to weigh down the diver's body to prevent buoyancy problems, they also caused serious mobility problems. Wearing these heavy boots underwater made it very difficult to swim or move efficiently. Because of the heaviness of these boots, there were horrific accidents happening regularly. A known one was when a diver got stuck in an underwater wreck. The weight of the boots, combined with the diver's reduced maneuverability, meant that there was no possibility of escaping. The diver was unable to swim to the surface, and the extra weight of the boots caused a fatal drowning. Eventually, diving boots became lighter and more pliable, but the old heavy gear boots are a great illustration of how diving equipment could be more of a problem than an aid. These boots look cool, but were definitely not safe. Prior to the invention and use of GPS, divers navigated underwater with analog compasses. These pre-GPS compasses were large and inaccurate, and they were not trustworthy when diving in currents or new and unfamiliar waters. The pre-GPS compasses sometimes did not compensate for underwater magnetic fields or were influenced by the metal within diving equipment. One of the more hazardous problems with these compasses was how easily divers would get disoriented. Compasses were not always readable, especially when divers swam into currents or depths that would mess with their bearings. There were accounts of divers getting lost as their compasses were faulty or inexact, and they ended up miles off course from their original destination. In one tragic instance, a diver who was relying on an outmoded compass was swept away by a current and lost, ultimately running out of air in his tank before help finally arrived. Nowadays, I can't even figure out how to go to the store without GPS, let alone dive in pitch darkness and limited air supply. And to end today's video, we have the squale masks, popular in early diving, which were famously uncomfortable and leaky. The faceplate was typically made of glass, and the rubber gasket was typically too stiff to form a good seal against a diver's face. This lack of seal meant that divers frequently had to deal with water flooding into their masks, blurring their vision and creating panic. You can imagine how that feels when you go snorkeling and a little water enters your mask, and you are on the surface with a life jacket on. Now think about this happening meters deep underwater with no way of fast resurfacing. I'll pass on this one. Sometimes divers were unable to purge water from their masks, which left them agitated and disoriented, especially on deep dives or when visibility was poor. Masks today are far more advanced, with improved sealing, comfort, and visibility, leaving the squale mask as a dangerous relic of the past that divers have nightmares about. The next one is the Farallon Diver Propulsion Vehicle. Just think about a propeller-driven scooter that would make you zoom across the water. Sounds like a lot of fun, doesn't it? But at the time, it was a ridiculously unsafe experiment and not a useful tool. These early models were often very large and clunky, resembling mini scooters that were very hard to keep under control. These early DPVs were unsteady, and their engines could suddenly shut down, leaving divers stranded deep beneath the surface with no way of swimming back up. And of course, the batteries didn't last for a very long time. The Farallon was really prone to malfunctioning. The most tragic accident was likely one in which a diver using a DPV discovered that it shut down mid-dive. With no way to return to the surface safely, and especially in time, the diver ran out of air and eventually passed. Lacking air and no way back sounds super scary. Definitely not the best way to go, don't you think? Let's take a look at the brass cuff expanders that were used in old diving suits to keep the arms and legs from constricting and cutting off circulation when underwater. The idea behind the cuff expanders was to be somewhat flexible, but as you can imagine, they were not even close to perfect. The brass cuffs would either malfunction by becoming too constrictive and cutting off circulation, or too loose and causing leaks that flooded the suit with water. In a tragic accident, a brass cuff was malfunctioning when the diver was in the midst of work at a substantial depth inside a wreck. The cuff was too tight and cut off the diver's blood flow to the arm. Numbness and failure of muscle function followed, which then left the diver disoriented and incapable of escaping. The brass cuffs too hurt and had a very high risk of injury since they were non-flexible. As diving suits improved, cuff expanders came to be replaced by newer, safer ways of providing mobility and preventing circulation issues. Definitely not the bracelets you want to get for your girlfriend. There you have it, the 10 most dangerous old-school diving elements that kindly have vanished with the times. How much more sophisticated we've become with the technology of today, where efficiency and security are at #1 priority. Just consider surviving with these old-school helmets, never knowing if or if not you would be out of air or trapped in an underwater wreckage due to those clunky, weighty boots. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, or should I say back to the ocean floor, don't forget to like and comment below, and don't forget to share this video with your diving buddies. Until next time, stay safe diving and keep exploring.